Hello everyone, myself Chetna Bhalia. Today I'm going to talk about the pedagogy, power, and the making of the compliant mind from Dickens' hard times to the algorithmic edge of education. This is my academic information as well as presentation information, table of contents. My research question is how does education both in Dickens' hard times and in the contemporary algorithmic learning environment functions as a mechanism of social control, and what possibilities exist for resistance through humanistic and the critical pedagogy? Hypothesis. Education from Dickens' classroom to the algorithmic age remains a mirror of power shaping minds to the serve system. True learning begins only when the pedagogy nurtures empathy, imaginations, and the courage to question control. When knowledge becomes humanized, it transforms obedience into the understanding. Only then can educations evolve from discipline to liberation. Introductions of like education as a mechanism of power. Education shapes knowledge, behavior, and the social norms, acting as a tool of social control. Like in Dickens' hard times, Dickens critiques that fact-based pedagogy that prioritize conformity over imaginations, empathy, and the moral development. In the modern algorithmic education, replicates compliance mechanism through surveillance, predictive analytics, and the standardized metric. Education is not neutral. It shapes students' value, agency, and the social positions, making the study of pedagogy crucial for the understanding social power and inequality. Sometimes it become positive way, in sometimes it will turn into the negative way. Historical context like 19th century utilitarian pedagogy, 19th century to 21st century, how emphasizes on the miserable knowledge. Utilitarian philosophy prioritized practical outcomes and the miserable knowledge over creative or the moral reasoning, framing education as a tool for social efficiency. Discipline and the industrial preparations. Schools aim to produce disciplined cities suited for the industrial label. Creative imaginations and the ethical development were often sacrificed to maintain conformity and the productive. So we have the example of Bitzer, who is a very factual and the fact-based student. Dickens critic. Through Gradgrind, Dickens dramatized the social and the moral consistency of the utilitarian pedagogy, showing the dehumanizing effect of the rigid fact-based educations for the industrial rising. They are using the students, they are making a laborer in the school. Grand's classroom, rigid compliance, like facts over fancy. Grand's principle that teach these boys and girls nothing but facts reflects a system that suppresses imaginations, moral reasoning, and the critical thoughts. How consequences for the students that imaginations and the individuality are subordinated to the obedience and the miserable performance, producing compliance learner ready for the societal demands. Grengright's pedagogy exemplifies that systematic productions of the docile, industrial, productive citizens emphasizes the control over human growth, knowledge classifications, and the institutional power. No institution have some power to control the educations. That knowledge was divided into the discrete little cabinets, reinforces hierarchies and the controlling access to the information. Now normalizations through observations, that exams and the constant observations regulated student behavior, creating self monitor subjects. To conduct exams is nowadays it's become only the procedures or the protocol, but it is our what we learn in the classroom we never apply in our job role, in our reality. Focalization perspective, like classroom serves as a mechanism for the producing docile bodies, using surveillance and the regulations to inform conformity. Docline bodies, we what I mean that docline body, it's that it is a set of roles that it is the control things which students, teachers and the institutions teach to students to become under the industrial power. The mechanistic classifications of knowledge mirrors industrial processes, highlighting the epistemic dimensions of the social control. Teachers as enforcers of control, agents of institutional power. Teachers act as a intermediate enforces schools norms and the expectations. They reward conformity and the punish deviations, ensuring students internalization into institutional priorities. Suppressions of the critical thinking, like in hard times, instructors prioritize roots memorizations over moral reasoning. Questions that challenge authority or explore ethic are discouraged, molding compliant behavior. How we can connect the modern parallel that in algorithmic classroom, educators relies on the AI and the analytic to monitor compliance, mediting both the human and the technology authority. It can be the negative perspective, but also have the positive perspective also in the AI learning. Educations and the class hierarchy, reproductions of the inequality. Schools are reflected and the enforces class hierarchies. Upper class students thrived while working class children were disciplined into the conformity. To connect this in the contemporary time, we also have some villages that they don't have this type of the AI learning and the educational way. Examples in hard times like Bitzer executes in the fact-based system, while CCTube represents the marginalized struggle under rigid pedagogy. Dickens demonstrates how schooling intersects with the labor, class mobility, and the social stratification, showing education as a tool of the industrial capitalism. Emotional and the moral repressions across characters like Tom, Louisa, and Bitzer exemplifies the emotional and the psychological toll of the rigid, fact-only educations. Their inability to exercise moral judgment or the imaginations demonstrate the limits of the utilitarian schooling. Moral and the emotional resistance, like Sissy Job embodies empathy, care, and the moral consciousness. Her resistance highlights the tensions between the institutional demands and the humanistic development. But Sissy is only one who suffers in that time. Dickens critics, like through these contrasting characters, Dickens dramatize the ethical and the psychological cost of the suppressions, emotional intelligence, showing how rigid pedagogy can distort character and relationship. Humanistic alternative like empathy, moral educations, creativity, critical thinking, agency, and the compassion. How humanistic pedagogy provide a counter model demonstrated that ethical, emotional, and the intellectual growth can coexist with the effective learning outcomes. Translations to contemporary education like algorithmic control, how technological meditations of learning, standardizations, and the complex AI learning management and the adaptive technologies, how monitor students' performance and the engagement. Algorithmic learning enforces compliance, quantitatively producing a digital announce of the industrial discipline Dickens critic. How algorithmic bias and reproductions of inequality focuses on compliance over creativity, like standardized metric-driven evolutions prioritize measurable behaviors over critical thinking, creativity, or the ethical reasoning. Algorithmic evolutions can pretreat social economy strategy, creating a digital equivalent of the Victorian hierarchies. Now we are like the 19th century's classroom to the algorithmic classroom in the 21st century. Control, surveillance, knowledge, resistance, assessment, social hierarchies, and emotional and the moral development. How these both 19th to the 20th century differentiated between these aspects. Resistance and the critical pedagogy in the digital age. Role of educators, the risk of sole algorithmic reliance. Ethical imperative and the policy implications. How policy recommendations like the curriculum design should include critical digital literary humanistic learning approaches and the ethical safeguards to mitigate the risk of algorithmic standardizations. So here I conclude that education functions as a mechanism of power, shaping knowledge, behavior, and the social values to enforces conformity and the sustain institutional authority. Education must align with the ethical and the democratic values, ensuring equality, inclusivity, and the holistic development of the individual in both traditional and the digital classroom. Here are my learning outcomes that I gain a deeper awareness of how both historical and contemporary forms of education shape not only what we learn but how we think and who we became. I now see education as space where resistance, ethics, and the creativity must coexist with the knowledge. So here are references which I have used, and thank you. So if anyone have any questions, so please free to ask.
So, Chetna, my question is, can technology in classroom replace the need for human guidance and moral teaching?
So no, human guidance is must be there, because if we are going in the 21st, here is in the 21st century, so we know that how we used the things, we know the step by step things, that no, we have to this is the process, so we you have to follow this process, but we don't know the reason behind it, the actual reason and the meaning or your personal development on it. Anyone else?
Hello, Chetna. So, my question is, how does algorithmic education influence student behavior and independence?
Students behavior, it's it depends on the students how they are taking AI learning and the modern educations in that way. In the positive way, so they can increase their critical thinking as well as their performance and the personality. And but in the negative way, so they decreasing their critical thinking as well as the performance. So thank you so much, this is from my side.